Hi, students. Seems like it's been a while since I've um, been with you in person. I apologize for that. It indeed has been a long few weeks. The A couple weeks ago, I was very ill with upper respiratory issues, and then, as you know, in order to put things into context, which is what we like to do in writing, especially in feature writing, I'll let you know that just after that week of illness in my family, we were slammed with a hurricane here in Florida. Literally, it started, well, south of us. Um, Cuba and Haiti were affected, and then South Florida, and then all the way up through the Carolinas. And so we're actually still dealing with the after effects of that. 2 weeks later, our yard, the front of at our curb is still a tremendous amount of debris that fell into our yard. Fortunately, during that time, we never lost power, but our children did. And so they kind of camped out in our home for about 5 days. So we are pulling our lives back together. And as we started to pull our lives back together, that very next week, I had a mishap and fell over a play gate at my daughter's home and injured myself pretty severely. Had some bruising to my chest wall and my abdominal cavity, as well as bruises to the rest of my body, my knees, my elbows, my arms. And so I had a bit of a time breathing, and so it wasn't a great time to come to you in any kind of a verbal way. Instead, I've tried to keep up with you via email, any questions that you've had, and in grading your extensive projects. I have yet to grade your second article. I've wanted to give it plenty of focused and attentive time. I also wanted you, however, to have the benefit of sitting down today, tomorrow, sometime in the next few days, and giving you some insight into the projects that you've already turned in, and into this last week of classes as you last week of class as you head into kind of a final wrap of your work, and to just share with you some insight into the kinds of things that I've seen, maybe some areas in which overall, as a class, you might be able to gain in developing and improving your work. I'm thinking right now of all of the projects that I've graded and all of the remarks that I've given. And what I'm going to do is just give some highlights as to what I've seen in the areas that I think that you might be able to improve on, and share some personal experiences in feature writing that I think might be of benefit to you. Feature writing is actually one of my favorite pastimes. It's something, the other thing that I didn't throw in there in the past few weeks that has really probably grabbed most of our attention, um, has been the heightened election season. Uh, it's been it's been chaos out there. It's probably even more so than the general election 4 years ago, and before that 8 years ago. It has probably been one of the most intense times that social media, YouTube, has been used to kind of wage this war. Is how I think it was Time magazine defined it that way. I'm looking over here because I just threw a Time magazine off of my desk that I think defined the new, I think, Twitter war, or just social media war, as regarding the election. Okay, so I've pulled out my notes, and I have some things open on the big screens in front of me, even though I'm taping this on my laptop, and I'll post it to YouTube. I wanted to start out really kind of at the beginning with your query letters, that and the articles that you ended up writing or focusing towards, say, a magazine that you're querying for a perspective article. I know that this is a class, and most of you, this was a chance to kind of have a lab experiment about, what would be the most ideal situation for the type of magazine, or the magazine in particular, that you would aspire to writing for. I did want to, however, throw in there that this is a time in your life, as a college student, as a beginning professional, or even as a professional, to be very practical. And in some of your queries, I would hope to see a very good dose of reality, practicality. That's part of understanding the whole process of writing. It's a self recognition, it's a cognition, a cognitive process of understanding who you are, what you can do, and how much you can expect from that process, where you need to go. There's something we have in the professional world, as you well know, called paying your dues. Um, might I suggest that when you do write a query as a writer, and you're launching your start, that you start out, I know your generation and my generation, even people are told to start big. Well, there's something called paying your dues. There's also something called building experience. You don't want to start out with something that's so unobtainable that you're going to immediately start receiving rejection notices. Yes, there's a chance, maybe one in 100,001, that your very first article might be published in Time Magazine, or Vanity Fair, or Cosmopolitan, or Better Homes and Garden. But chances are that if you start in a more immediate market, a community-based magazine or newspaper, or an online publication that you're very familiar with, or a blog that that you've participated in and offered your work, even for no compensation, that you will be able to launch yourself. I remember the very first article that I submitted that was printed above the fold, and that's very significant. Above the fold simply means when you have a newspaper and you fold it in half and you look at the top, anything that's above the fold is the lead article. I had a lead article and picture printed in the Hannibal Courier Post, one of the oldest newspapers in Missouri, a Pulitzer Prize winning paper, in 1989. It was the first in-depth news story that I had written for a major newspaper, and I wasn't paid for it. I hadn't queried it. I simply wrote it. It was about a major news event that went on in St. Louis. I had gone with the Missouri Citizens for Life organization and covered that event from a very fair point of view, and dumped a canister of film and a disc, a 3x5 floppy disk, on the desk of the editor the next morning. And that was published in the afternoon newspaper. It was one of the few afternoon papers around left in Missouri. I was thrilled to death. I was still sleeping because I hadn't slept the night before, when I got a call from my journalism professor at Hannibal Grange University, and she told me that my article had been picked up, and with very little editing, and carried in the afternoon version. I still have a framed copy of that somewhere in my archives. All that to say that we start somewhere, and usually we're not going to start in Time Magazine, or maybe our top magazine. But if we look for practical ways to offer our work, and even to query and sell our work, we're going to make a splash and get started, and let people see what we've published. But we're going to be careful to not be to promise too much that we can't deliver. I've seen the opposite of people being too limiting, but I've also seen the opposite of people promising too much and then not being able to deliver what they have promised. If you deliver, or if you promise that you are a person who has a lot of experience that can deliver, three 500-word articles about such and so, but then they're not focused, they're not well paraphrased or paragraphed, they're not well styled, they don't have solid evidence, and the editor gets those and they're not edited very well, they have mistakes in them, then you will probably never write for that organization again if they've given you a chance to submit something even. They won't consider your submissions very seriously. I hope you understand that. So look for reasonable opportunities to be able to submit query letters, submit your work, ask them, give them ideas, but also ask people what they want. I think the text might be a little bit weak on that. That the process is really twofold. I have a lot of good freelancers that write for me, but I also give them assignments. I don't only wait for ideas that they propose to me. I love when they give me ideas, but there are some things that I need to be written that I actually make the assignments to them. I just forward them a link, forward them an idea, and say, go for it. And so it does kind of go two ways, especially with really reliable freelancers. Okay, so enough on that freelance idea and queries. On interviewing, um, the section on interviews that we talked about and all of the work that you did on interviews was very good as far as asking the right questions and so forth, setting up for the interview. The main thing is to do a lot of extensive research about whatever topic it is that you're going to be interviewing a person about. Recently, the governor, after the hurricane, showed up at my church Sunday morning. I didn't realize that he'd even be there until literally right beforehand. That night before, somebody said that, no, not even the night before, that Sunday morning in church, the pastor announced from the pulpit that the governor was actually there in the congregation and invited him up to speak about the hurricane and safety and the fact that people were still without electricity. Literally, the hurricane hit on Thursday, Friday, and here the governor was on Sunday. So I am familiar with Governor Scott. I have met him previously. And so I thought, wow, this is a great opportunity to interview the governor and see what he has to say, because from the pulpit, he really didn't talk about the work of faith-based organizations and helping out during a hurricane. He really only talked about the electricity being restored in Jacksonville and the cleanup and for people to be patient. He talked about the safety issues. And so I thought, wow, this is a great opportunity for him to talk about the work of faith-based organizations and how he appreciates that and how faith-based organizations come alongside and help in disaster relief during and after hurricanes and so forth, and how valuable that is. It's a little bit of a different slant. The news organization that I work for has a faith-based intent. So afterwards, after church, I noticed that he was mingling with people and meeting the public. So I headed down to the front of the church, actually snagged my 10-year-old grandson and said, hey, Joey, come with me and see how this is done. And watched and took some pictures while he was shaking hands with people. I thought this will be good for my story. And then I kind of sidled up to the PR person from the church and said, hey, Jeff, who is his chief of staff or who is his PR person? Because I want to ask for a quick interview. Jeff said, pointed the gentleman out to me. So I went over and talked to his chief of staff for a second and said, does the governor have a few minutes after he is finished meeting people that I could ask him a few questions? And he said, let me check. So he talked to this chief of staff, talked to the communications person. They went over and talked to Jeff, the communications director from the church, to verify who I was. That's fair. And Jeff told them I was fine. He's familiar with my work. I'm actually a longtime member of the church. And the chief of staff came back and said, absolutely, he can answer some questions. Would you mind asking those on your way out as we escort him to his vehicle? I said, absolutely. That is what is referred to as a walk and talk. So I waited for him to get his things together. I stood there with his staff. I had my handy iPhone ready as long as you have an iPhone or other kind of smartphone with you, typically you will never be without a recording a device. And so this is what I used as my recording device. I simply switched it on and did a voice, where is it? A voice memo. Switched on the voice memo feature right there and was able to have a tape recorder right at my hand. And as we were walking out, I started thinking very quickly, this was his first major hurricane. I already had familiarization since 2002 with hurricane coverage in Florida. And so I just kind of refreshed my mind really quickly about some things I could ask him. I asked him some questions walking all the way out. He seemed to be impressed that I knew anything about hurricane coverage and disaster relief. He seemed very eager to answer my questions. I got some great questions into him. He gave me some wonderful answers. He actually stood at the door of the church afterwards, talked to me for several minutes until his press person said, Governor, we need to go. So that was good. The good news was he was needing to wrap it up and not me. I respected his time. He went out the door. I got a few more pictures as he was leaving, and he got in his vehicle after shaking a few more hands, and then he left. Wonderful chance for an interview. Let me give you another quick interview story. When asking questions of somebody, even when you're prepared, don't be so over-prepared that you're not really listening to what they're saying. This is a story I'm going to tell you that a weatherman told to a group of my students, my high school students, probably 15 or so years ago. There was a weatherman, Brian Busby, I think his name was, in Kansas City, Missouri, who came to speak to a group of students. He said a young reporter from he may have been from St. Louis, either St. Louis or Kansas City. So they were either from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch or the Kansas City Star, big newspapers, came and interviewed him and was asking him about what it's like to be a weatherman and so forth. Just went down this list of questions. Where are you from? Where were you born? Where were you educated? Which, by the way, most of those could be ferreted out ahead of time by simply asking somebody for their resume or their office worker. Those are not necessarily questions that you would need to waste your time with during an interview. You might get their resume ahead of time or ask them for their resume or look up their bio on LinkedIn or something and then just confirm those things with them. Get those things out of the way by confirming those things with them first. But those aren't the kind of things that you usually want to weigh down an interview with by making them talk about mundane things and then, well, how do you spell that? Duke University or Saranova or something, and making them stop and spell that. You can do that homework on your own. You can Google that. Okay, so she had gone through some very mundane questions, and then she said to him, so who is a hero? Who's your biggest hero in your life? And these are honestly the kind of questions that he was talking about were the kind of questions you asked for a junior, what I call a junior high interview. Like, what's your favorite book? Who's your biggest hero? What are your hobbies? Now, we ask those same kinds of questions universally to people everywhere, especially when we don't know much about them, in order to learn more about them. But honestly, as adults, we probably try to make them a little bit more sophisticated. We probably try to say, what was the most impactful thing a world leader said that you internalized most recently? It might be just a more sophisticated way of asking a question that will elicit a more sophisticated response. If you ask someone who is their favorite leader, they might just say Mahatma Gandhi and then just go on. We might want to elicit a deeper response, which will make a more interesting article for a more sophisticated audience, if you understand what I'm saying. Okay, so this person asked, though, who is who is a person that you admire? Who's your hero or something like that? So he said, my grandmother. And she just looked at him. Okay, so what's your grandmother's name? And he told her. And then he said something very significant. And I he said, and she just died about a month ago. And okay, the reporter said, okay. And then she looked down at her notes and she goes, and he said, I lived with her when I was growing up. And this young reporter said, okay. She wrote that down. And he just sat there and waited. And then the reporter said, looked at him and smiled and said, so what are your hobbies? And he looked at her with a straight face and he said, laminating large animals. Laminating large animals. Okay, so they finished, wrapped up the rest of the interview with a few more mundane questions like that. He didn't give much of a description. He Matter of fact, she asked him a few more questions about that, laminating large animals. Oh, wow, I learned how to do that in Alaska. And, bears were my favorite. And that was about it. And so she got back to the newspaper offices and she wrote up this profile on Brian Busby, the weatherman, turned it into her editor. And her editor just sat there and looked at this. And it was written up very chronologically. He was born, he went to school. These were his the laminating large animals. What is that? So he calls the young writer in and says, what is this? Laminating large animals in Alaska? And she looks at him and she's like, well, I don't really know. I mean, that's what he said. So the editor says, okay, take your break, go to lunch, do whatever. Calls Brian on the phone. Brian, what is this? And he said, what was I supposed to say? She was asking me about my grandmother. I wanted to cry. This is an emotional time for me. I told her that she just died. Here's the point. There would have been a wonderful story about how close Brian Busby was to his grandmother, who had just died. He grew up with her. She meant the world to him. She inspired him to pursue journalism. He had great stories about how she would allow him to go up on the roof and install a weather vane. There was a wonderful story to be had. This young journalist did not hear. She didn't listen. She wasn't paying attention. She was paying attention to her list of questions. She was trying to get through her list. Are you hurrying your subjects? Are you hurrying the process? Are you trying to get through your list? Are you trying to hurry your lead? Some of my best leads have been after the interview. If I've given the person enough time to talk and not tried to talk over them and get to the next question, because I've had to learn how to do that as well, is in after I transcribe the interview. And transcription is necessary, especially for a good feature story. To go back over it and look at it. What did that person really say? and think about it. Wow, that was really significant. Because when you're there, sometimes you can't see the forest for the trees. You don't know where you're going to start yet. You don't know what the lead should be yet. If you already know that, then I feel bad for you, because I don't know how you can possibly know that. If you've already determined that, decided that before you've ever even interviewed that person, then you may miss the best story yet, which is exactly the point of the Weatherman. The best story was missed because the reporter had already decided what the story would be, and it was a boring, mundane story. Don't determine the story ahead of time. Listen to what the person you interview is saying. Interviews are important. It's that person's time. That's where the idea of, oh, I need to go get a quote. I need to go get a quote from somebody, whether it's a news story, whether it's a feature story. That is an insult to get a quote from somebody. To get a quote from somebody implies that you're fulfilling the part of the story that you want. It's predictable, and you want to be able to drop in a point of view that you've already anticipated belongs there. You're getting a quote from them. You're telling them what to say, even almost, or giving them a question that you know is going to elicit a specific response. Make your interviews count. Yes, think about the questions you're going to ask ahead of time, but also be willing to ditch some of them if the interview goes in a different way. Also be willing to ditch the entire story if the interview goes in a certain way. There's part of your assignment that talked about on the record, off the record, when a person asks to read the story before it's produced and so forth. A lot of that is going to depend on your particular publication's rules. It's going to depend on your standard of ethics as a reporter. I'm going to cut this video short for time. We're almost at 30 minutes, and go into part 2, which I hope you're going to watch. And I'm going to make that one shorter. But in part 2, I'm going to talk about ethics. I'm going to talk about on and off the record. And then I'm going to give you a couple of examples of prize-winning feature stories that I've been involved with that have included those kinds of ethical questions, even in as much as a couple of those were in overseas stories, and cultural and ethical concerns of stories that I wrote that were where I was in Iraq in 2012. So that will be part 2, and hopefully these will give you some help with some of the things I've been seeing in your stories. And then I'll also hit on crafting. So I promise I won't go over 15 or 20 minutes in part 2. And this will get you off for a good start to a grand finale of a week. Thank you for listening, and hope to see you in part 2.